Beauty. So for folks who are here, you can start joining the poll everywhere. We'll be doing this for our warm up today. Oh, thank you. There's this great site called Her Universe that it's from. I'm just realizing the dates are really weird on our syllabus, so I will take a look and get those revised. I have today, and then I have another Monday after Monday. I'm not gonna do that to any of us. Oh, I love that. Alrighty. So how was the exam? I feel okay? Alright, I think they are a lot better now that I made them take home. You used to do the multiple choice part in class, and to be honest, the first one of the semester, a lot of people bombed it. And it was never my intention, so I'm very happy to be able to offer it this way and have people actually succeed on it, so. Alrighty, so for folks just getting here, folks on the Zoom as well, please join the poll everywhere here. You can do it on your phone or on your, and any kind of computer that you have. And this is just a couple quick questions for warm up. It looks like some of you have been able to do them already, which is great. And so if you haven't done poll everywhere before, it's a really nice piece of software where I can ask you questions and then they'll populate in real time up here on the screen. And so, how do you feel about Freud going into this lecture as our first one? And usually they have the link still. Well, that's weird. And I'll write it up here just in case folks I love that, like, whoever brought in this box of chalk last week, it was full. And then I had left out some chalk, and then like already this is almost empty. Where does it go? But you're gonna go to whole ev. Sorry, that's like the worst noise. .com/my name, Taryn Myers. And it's Myers, not Mey. And then 601. It's a 1, not an L. Alrighty. So polev.com/Taryn-Myers601. All right, so how do you feel about Freud going into this lecture? Looks like most folks are like, he's just some dude that we learn about, which fair. Very true. You're going to learn about him in almost every psych class you take, right? We circle back to Freud. Some people don't know much about him. Some people actively hate him. I feel you. I get it. Once upon a time, I actually actively hated Freud. And throughout this lecture, I'll explain why some of my opinions have changed, although not all. Alrighty, and then this is one of my favorite types of questions they can do. What's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word Freud? And what you'll see is as you all add them, these will change and flip. But a lot of people are thinking of psychoanalysis, psychodynamic, theories, phallic, creepy, love it. Psychologist, sexual, unconscious, strange, yes, feel that too. Necessary, psychologist, sex-based. And so again, I love this because as you all put in words, it makes the words bigger that more people are putting in, basically. So a lot of people are saying psychodynamic, phallic, psychoanalysis, necessary, and sex. Yeah, I gotta talk about sex and we're gonna talk about Freud, right? Freud is almost like the whole reason why I have to have disclaimers on this class. Although when we get to some of the like biopsych stuff, we do talk about mating behavior. I remember when they still brought tours into this building. They don't do that anymore, apparently. They'll just sort of like be like, there's village too, and keep walking. But I was teaching in the social science lab and the big blinds were up, and I was teaching about mate selection and evolutionary psych. And like these tour people walked by when we were talking about like, if you had to rescue or, you know, let somebody die, would it be this person or this person? And I could just see the horror in their eyes, just like, sorry, I apologize. All right, so yeah, psychodynamics, phallic, and psychoanalysis are the big ones that are popping up. Dude, strange, love that. Freud's just some dude. Cool. Well, again, I'm going to try and do these little warm-ups at points throughout the semester just to get us thinking about this, and also, you know, honestly being honest about our relationships with the material and how sometimes those are not pleasant, and that's okay, right? It's okay not to like Freud. So Freud's our first theorist we start with, primarily because he was the first really documented theorist we have to start talking about this stuff. I am positive there were people before Freud. There were people in like pre-written times who were thinking about these things, right? But we don't have documentation about them. And so Freud's our real person here. So the disclaimer, as a couple of you indicated, so there are some people who hate Freud. And when he was teaching us about Freud, Dr. Michael Levine actually said this exact quote, "I hate Freud." And as I mentioned, my opinion about him has sort of changed over time. I'm still very critical of many of his ideas. But one of the things that you have to appreciate, even in an abstract way about Freud, is that he did try to explain everything. He's one of the few theorists to try to explain development, psychopathology, personality. He even has a theory where he tried to explain how things work in the brain that I didn't learn about till grad school. And honestly, as someone who's a trained clinical psychologist, the fact that he is the founder of talk therapy, right, is amazing. Back in 2017, we took students on a J-term session to London, Paris, and Amsterdam, and we visited Freud's house in London. It sounds so weird to say, but it almost felt like a spiritual experience for me. It could be like, there's the couch where talk therapy started, right? Which is like my whole thing. So that is wonderful and that is great. And a lot of who we'll talk about through the rest of the semester reacted to Freud. And so maybe their theories wouldn't have been formed as quickly if they hadn't had Freud to argue with, right? That being said, he wrote just about everything he wrote in a way that could not be tested empirically. And that's really problematic for the science of psychology, right? So a little bit of background about Freud, again, to try to give us some context for him and why he was the way he was, right? Why he wrote the things he did. So throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Freud's ideas have had a huge impact on how the mind is understood to operate. You can really see his influence still today. There are still people who actively practice psychoanalysis, for example. And then some of his ideas are incorporated into any type of therapy that you do. And we'll talk about those throughout this lecture. He's in pop culture. There's a Freud action figure. I have a Freud rubber duck in my office that I got at the Freud Museum in London. You know, and if people know him, like a Halloween costume that I've seen people wear is a Freudian slip, right? So they just get like a slip dress and then they put words on it related to Freud. Simple, easy. I mean, maybe that's just psychologists, but it's a pretty easy costume if anyone's looking for one. He laid the foundation for many topics and questions that psychologists are honestly still trying to figure out and address. So he's not always important. He's not only important, there's the word I was looking for, in psychology, but also to think about him as sort of a historical figure and a pop psych figure. And so he was alive from 1856 to 1939. So to put this in context, he was alive during like the American Civil War, right? Darwin is writing about the same time as Freud. There's a lot of upheaval in the world. And we'll get to this, but he spends the end of his life in London because he was Jewish and 1939 in Vienna. It wasn't really great to be Jewish, right? So he was born in what is now the Czech Republic. His dad was a wool merchant, so probably middle class-ish. As I mentioned, his family was Jewish. He didn't practice as an adult, but he was very conscious of his Jewish origin and heritage. When Freud was born, his father was 41 and his mother was 21. He was their first son. His mom was very loving and protective. His dad was very stern and authoritarian. His mom was also apparently very beautiful, objectively. So you can see seeds of that maybe coming up later, right? Freud later did psychoanalysis on himself, and he said he learned that his feelings towards his parents were mixed with fear and love, respect and hate. He really was the favored son. He was born with a small portion of the fetal sac covering his head. This is called a cowl. And in sort of the folk knowledge of the time, that meant you were like a favored person. And it also, according to folklore, meant that he would be famous. I mean, he was. I don't know if that was because of the cowl, right? Or just because he kind of wrote his butt off. But he had 6 younger siblings, 5 sisters and 1 brother. He was born an uncle. His dad, a widower, had grown-up children, and one of the grown children had a child already who was Freud's nephew, John. And he was really close to his nephew because they were around the same age. I think John was like a year older than Freud. And many suggested, maybe not surprisingly, that all this unusual family constellation set the stage for his theories, particularly about the Oedipus complex. At the age of 4, his family moved to Vienna, and he lived there until the late 1930s, when it was overwhelmed by the Nazis. He was a good student, but he also succeeded over his siblings primarily because he was seen as the favored child. And so he was given resources to pursue his studies that they were not. So for example, he had his own room, whereas they shared. He was allowed to study using an oil lamp, which is much more long-lasting, sustainable light. His siblings had to use candles. He wanted to be a mighty warrior or a minister of state, but unfortunately, as a Jewish individual, his professional choices were limited. So he did go to medical school, so Freud would be today what we call a psychiatrist. That term wasn't necessarily in existence at that point in time. And he was trained to be a neurologist. And so he studied animal biology, like the nervous system of fish, the testes of the eel. He studied neurons in squid. Those were really common back then because especially the larger squid have very large neurons, so it's easy to see them. And he also trained under a guy who was really into hypnosis, and so Freud learned that as well. Later in life, he studied the anesthetic properties of cocaine. He suggested that cocaine may be a good antidepressant. It is for very short periods of time, right? Basically while you're high. And he later conceded that he suffered from its use and he may have had a cocaine addiction, actually. So Freud depended on his private practice, seeing patients, having them pay him for a living. So as he became interested in writing, in theorizing, he had to keep seeing so many clients in order to fund his writing, basically because you don't get paid until the book's published, right? And he became really interested in what's called neurosis. And that is an old term for emotional disturbance. Now we would kind of use the term anxiety, although neurosis kind of encapsulated more than that. It would have included what we now call somatoform disorders. It would have included depression. And these are emotional disturbance where the vast majority of the time people can go about their daily lives. So they were seeing him on an outpatient basis. And actually, as far as I know, Freud never worked consistently in any sort of inpatient facility. He did all outpatient therapy. So Freud's goal was to complete a complete theory of humanity. And he, again, got fairly close. He hoped that by studying neuroses, he would eventually have a key to the study of psychological processes in general. And so, as I mentioned, he went to Paris. I could not think of Charcot's name off the top of my head, but he went to Paris to study with Jean Charcot, who was a psychiatrist. And so again, this was like the start of psychiatry. People were starting to figure out how do we treat people with neuroses and other non-physical mental conditions. So then he trained in hypnosis with Joseph Breuer. This was after he returned from Paris. He heard about Breuer's, what he called the talking cure. So Breuer would get his clients to talk very freely about their problems, but he would do it under hypnosis. If you're not familiar with what hypnosis is, it is a way of putting people into a much more relaxed, some people call it a trance state, where people tend to be more open, more willing and able to discuss things. It's interesting to kind of compare that with like a mindfulness meditation state, and I think that a lot of psychologists would argue that there are differences, right? But that there are some similarities as well. So Breuer and Freud collaborated. They published something called Studies in Hysteria in 1895. If you're not familiar with the term hysteria, it's got all kinds of fun things tied up in it. It literally translates, hyster means womb or uterus, and it means wandering womb. So once upon a time, people thought that when women had any kind of mental disorder, the uterus would literally get up and like walk around their body. So like if you had a somatoform disorder where your arm was numb and there was no physical cause, that meant your uterus was just hanging out in your shoulder, you know, like you do. Obviously this is not actually what happens. But this term hysteria was still used at that time to describe sort of this wide range of problems that they saw, particularly in middle and upper class women, who at the time were fairly repressed, and we'll get to that on the next slide. This idea of the talking cure really intrigued Freud. And it led to his interest in free association, which is the idea where you just get people to talk. And if they just start talking, important stuff comes, right? And that can help drive the process. And this became what was psychoanalysis later. Breuer did not feel that sexuality was important in neurosis, and obviously Freud really developed that idea. But Freud's big contribution here was taking what Breuer did under this, again, hypnotic trance-like state and saying, what if we didn't have to do all the smoke and daggers? What if we just talked? Again, like, seems like that shouldn't be a novel concept, but at the time it was. So again, to situate Freud historically, culturally, he was in Victorian Austria. So non-reproductive sexuality of any kind, including sex for pleasure, masturbation, homosexuality, those are considered perverse and taboo. There's a lot of emphasis on repression of fundamental drives. There's a lot of emphasis on women in particular being controlled, right? And only having limited options. The sexual act was considered beastly, but it was tolerated because of the shortcomings of men and the need for reproduction to carry on the species. Any kind of natural excretory functions were viewed with shame. And again, I'm giving you all this context because in a few slides here, we'll start talking about Freud's stage theory, right? Which talks about all this stuff. It talks about poop, and it talks about sex, right? It talks about all kinds of things that were just taboo at the time. To give you a little bit of context, when I was on my residency year, I went to Columbia, South Carolina for a day. We visited a historic home, and it had one of those really pretty, like, staircases that divided, right, and went two ways. And this is from around the time Freud was working. And they said, I always just thought that was like an architectural feature, but they said, no, that was actually done because the men and the women would go down different sets of staircases so that the men didn't accidentally see the women's ankles. Because that was scandalous at the time, right? So again, this is the culture that Freud is bringing all this forth in, right? And this prohibition of sexual behaviors and prohibition of women really having any role outside the home, particularly obviously middle and upper classes, working women or working class women have always had to work, right? They were laundresses and washerwomen and maids in larger houses. But Freud argued that these are what is leading to anxiety, fear, worry, repression, and his favorite, hysteria. Interestingly, this was also a time of a cultural renaissance in philosophy, music, and literature. So a lot of great things are being published around this time. I mean, this is like the time of Jane Austen, right? This is the time of, you know, the French salons and intellectual revolutions. more and more people were starting to question these prohibitions against sex and sexuality. And Freud started to propose that pleasure, and he actually calls it the pleasure principle, is an important underlying function, not only of sex itself, but of like life in general. And again, that doesn't sound novel, right? But it was at the time and in that cultural context. This is not to say no one in written history had ever thought of sex as positive before, right? Certainly people had. But it was just Freud was really coming up with this in a time where this would have been really frowned upon. And so Freud continued to develop and revise his work until he died. He was still writing at the end. And so, as I mentioned, being in Vienna in the 1930s was not great if you were Jewish. The Nazis were invading. At one point, Freud's assets were all frozen. And so he was trying to leave the country and he had no money to like buy a train ticket. And because he was famous and because he knew people he had trained, other psychoanalysts around Europe, for example, there was a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, a woman psychoanalyst who helped him, and other colleagues in France and England. They were able to get him to London, and he took all of his possessions with him that he was able to bring. So if you go to the Freud house in Vienna, there's nothing original there, because he took it all with him. So if you go to the Freud House and Museum in London, you see the original couch, you see all his sculptures. We'll talk probably next week about Anna Freud. You see Anna's bedroom. She lived in the same house as him for her whole life. Freud eventually died from cancer of the jaw, most likely related to all his cigar smoking, right? Very heavy tobacco use. It got so bad at the end of his life, and sorry, I know it's fairly early in the morning, this is graphic, but that he actually like had a hole in his cheek because of what they had to do to remove it. He never quite got to a complete theory of humanity, but man, he got close. And there's still a lot of archival data about Freud that is yet to be completely released because of like the way his estate was set up, which is really interesting. The picture here I love. So this is his dog, who was his companion, but then he noticed that when he was doing therapy, he did it out of his home. He just had like a study downstairs where the clients would come in. And he noticed that his dog's presence acted as a calming influence on his patients. Children and adolescents in particular seemed to better able to disclose painful information with a dog nearby, but adults benefited in very similar ways. And so it seemed to him that the mere presence of a dog in the room lowered the barriers of resistance that humans erect to avoid painful subjects, and so facilitated the therapeutic process. So Freud may have been the first person in history to have a therapy dog, basically, which is kind of cool. And again, not something he ever theorized about. He just sort of noticed, like, hey, when my dog wanders in, people open up more. And this is something that, like, not only is used therapeutically today, but for example, in certain court systems, if a child is testifying, they'll actually have a therapy dog that will sit with the child while they testify. And kids tend to feel more comfortable and braver. So as I mentioned, there is a Freud action figure. I believe Dr. Jackson has one in his office. Tell me about your mother, right? And so the really interesting thing about Freud, again, looking back on him 100 years later, right, is that we think of Freud as very non-scientific, kind of this kooky guy, right? But Freud was trying to be scientific at the time. So the reason he referred to psychodynamics is he was thinking of this in the physics term, where dynamic means force. And so he was trying to make rules and guidelines kind of like thermodynamics in physics. So psyche or psycho means the mind, the soul, the spirit. So therefore, dynamics of the psyche or psychodynamics emphasizes the interplay of forces in the mind. And what Freud really contributed was the idea that some of these forces are outside of conscious awareness. We are not aware of everything going on in our minds. Conflict and the conflict between these forces in particular is at the core of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory. And again, Freud was trying to be scientific. He was just really limited by the methods available to him at the time, but also his own biases, I would say. So one of the things that Freud came up with as he thought of these thermodynamics of the mind, right, psychodynamics, was the mind as a space that had depth. And he didn't map this onto any portion of the brain, but he felt the mind was this entity that existed that we could study. So he was interested in what lies below the surface, what people are not aware of. And so he talked about, this was his initial idea about levels of consciousness. And so the first part he looked at was what was conscious. That's pretty common, right? These are things on the surface level, it's just what it sounds like. They're the things we're aware of. And Freud argued that these interact not only with external forces around us, other people, things, and the environment, right? But also with what's going on below our level of consciousness. Then he argued underneath that was the pre-conscious. He again abbreviated these things, trying to look kind of scientific, so CS, PCS here. And this includes images or episodes in your life. And Freud's idea was that the pre-conscious is what controls our behavior. It's focused on modifying the outside world as much as we can. But if we can't, then changing our behavior to meet the conditions of the outside world. So basically, the pre-conscious is trying to find a fit between the outside environment and us. The sensor is this border between the pre-conscious and the next level we're going to talk about, the unconscious. And so Freud said that this is like a screen door between them. So there are some levels of safeguarding from the unconscious, right? If you think of a screen door, like you're going to keep out people, you're going to keep out big flies, right? But then like gnats can get through, right? There's stuff that can get through a screen door. One of the ways that this idea of the sensor has been described is like a crooked customs agent. So there's no strength across the border. There might be smuggling, bribery, stuff sneaks in or out, right? And so that's the sensor, that it's trying to protect us from what's in the unconscious, but it can't always do the best job. The unconscious is that depth of the mind. It exists and operates outside of conscious awareness. So one of the things that's happened in pop culture is that people love to use the word subconscious. And Freud never used that word. To Freud, it wasn't that it was under conscious awareness, it was that it was completely outside of conscious awareness altogether. So he preferred the term unconscious to subconscious. The dynamic unconscious consists of forces, urges, drives, needs, passions, dreams, ideas, wishes, words, emotions, and then also desires. And it's all seeking expression or discharge. And when it sneaks through the sensor, it can come out in a whole host of ways. And one of the ways was psychopathological behavior, right? One of the ways is inappropriate behavior or words. The The unconscious to Freud is capable only of wishing. It in and of itself cannot enact on the outside world, cannot directly cause our behavior. It's capable only of wishing to do those things. Under ordinary circumstances, the unconscious cannot become conscious. We have no idea that what is out of our conscious awareness is there. We have no idea we think or we feel or we exist this way. What happens, Freud argues, is that people keep shoving stuff down, right, into the unconscious. And you've got this screen door that's not a very good screen door to begin with. And that's a lot of pressure pushing up, right? And so there's some tension buildup. We can't describe it with words. And it will be discharged or charged with emotional tension and come out again in these really like odd ways that surprise us. So those of you who've learned about Freud in intro or other classes, this is gonna start to sound a little familiar, right? This feels a little like the id ego and the super ego. And in fact, that's what we're gonna talk about next. So this is as Freud's theories evolved, he started to map these ideas onto the preconscious, the sensor, the unconscious, and then what is conscious. So, really interesting thing about Freud's writing is Freud wrote in his native language. He didn't write in Latin. And for some reason, when his work was translated to English, they chose to put fancy terms in, or novel terms, I guess, into Latin. And so we have this word, the id, sounds fancy, sounds abstract. In Freud's original writings, it was the ich, which just means the it, right? And if you think about the it just makes so much more sense, right? It's something fundamental, it's this thing that we know is there, but we can't control. To Freud, the id, the ich, was down here in on the unconscious, and it was the seat of that dynamic unconscious. The ich was ruled by the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle, there we go, is fundamental hedonism. The idea is we want the world and we want it now. The ich, the id wants immediate gratification. It wants to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. And the idea was that we primarily act on this as infants and young children, but that as we become adults, we are supposed to become better at not reacting to the ich. The best description I have ever heard of the id was by Dr. Newberry, my grad school professor who taught me personality. And he said the id is like Cookie Monster. It's like, me want cookie, me want sex, right? That's weird to hear Cookie Monster saying. But that's the idea, that it just like takes what it wants, doesn't care about what is like the path of destruction that's left behind, if you think about like all the cookie crumbs from Cookie Monster, right? And so, as you can imagine, it's powerful, and it can be somewhat dangerous to us. The id also engages in what Freud called primary process thinking. And that is the thinking that's associated with that pleasure principle. Primary process thinking. Primary process thinking has no logic in the way that like our consciousness has logic. It is timeless. Opposites coexist without problems. Opposites are not considered illogical within the realm of the id. The thinking is very free, it flows easily. And just how we just talked about the unconscious being incapable of doing anything but wishing, that's primary process thinking, right? So it's a lot of dreams, wants, desires. The id doesn't have a direct way to make those happen. And so what we'll see throughout our talk on Freud is that that leads to a lot of problems that come out in a lot of strange ways. If the id is given free rein, these forces will find ways to express themselves. Typically, when this happens, we say or do things, or both, that we regret later on. We have to discharge that built up tension in some way. And Freud argued that as we grow older, we should realize that we cannot immediately satisfy all of our urges and impulses, just in general, but also without being punished by society, whether that is direct punishment or whether that's like shunning, right? And that's where the ego starts to come in. So the ego is what Freud used to call the preconscious. It forms as we grow older and we realize that we can't just do whatever we want. I know, it's a bummer, right? The ego is aware of what will make you feel pain, and it's rational about it. The ego detects tensions and looks inwardly and to the outside world. So as you can see, it's kind of straddling right here. It's much more rational and realistic than the id, and it tries to find out how to discharge all those tensions the id has in socially acceptable ways. The ego is ruled by the reality principle, and the idea of the reality principle is, yeah, we all have these weird id desires, right? But we can't be Cookie Monster. We can't go around and just grab every cookie, right? We must operate in an acceptable manner and conform to the expectations of society. So the ego's main job ends up being compromising. Compromise formation. So find a middle course between the competing demands of what we're having to do within the outside environment and our consciousness, and then what the id wants down in our unconscious. Find that middle course between the competing demands of motivation, morality, practicality. Also, among the many things a person wants at the same time, right? Sometimes, you know, I have to get this done for work, I have to call this person back, I have to do this. But I also, if I don't eat something right now, I'm going to pass out, right? And so your ego's in Freud's words is like what helps you sort those things out. The result of the compromise is what we consciously think or do. So what an individual actually consciously thinks and actually does. So the purpose of this reality principle is effectively to serve the purpose of the pleasure principle, but in, again, a socially acceptable way. Make it happen in a way that is not going to get us ostracized, right? If you ran through the dining hall and grabbed all the cookies and ate them like Cookie Monster, people would be like, is she okay? Is he okay? Are they okay? Maybe we should call someone. Maybe not surprisingly, the reality principle is called secondary process thinking. So we have primary process thinking for the id, secondary process thinking for the ego. And the idea here is that this is associated with being human. That you know what is appropriate, and you use your memory, your perception of what's going on in the moment. You use your planning, your judgment, your decision making, all things that in modern science we know are tied to our prefrontal cortex, things that make us human, right? And you use those to act in, again, socially acceptable ways. Ego instincts are instincts of self-preservation, and they allow us to exist within the real world, within a social structure. Humans are pack animals, herd animals, right? We exist within a social structure. The last part that Freud came up with is the superego. And the idea is that the superego is guided entirely by ideals and rules and morals. It is the representation mentally of the societal rules, societal taboos, mores. So again, if we think about Freud existing in Victorian Austria, right? This would have been really like prescient to him. So Freud argued this superego didn't develop until later in childhood. And it stores the moral rules and regulations of how to conduct yourself appropriately. So sometimes the superego is referred to as the supermoral. It's a part of the psyche that always wants you to function according to the societal ideals. And so one of the things that this has been represented as, again, you've got your ego trying to like compromise with everything. You got the superego saying we must uphold the moral values. Or you've got the id just saying, I want a cookie, right? The ego has to do a lot of compromising, and one of the best like descriptions of this I've seen is psychomachia, which if you don't know what that means, a big fancy word for in cartoons, how you would see like an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. Right. So like the superego could be this angel on your shoulder, and it could be this devil on your shoulder, and oftentimes it's something in the middle, right? That is what you have to try to navigate. This is another nice representation of Freud's id, ego, and superego. And so any Titanic fans will get the reference to an iceberg, right? The idea is like we only really see the ego and what the ego lets us see, but there's a whole bunch of stuff beneath the surface we don't see, right? And that the superego can be down there too. One of the things that's a little bit less talked about with Freud's theories is that he talked about two main forces or instincts in life. The top one, the libido, we think about just related to sex and therefore related to Freud. And this is your life drive or instinct. It's also your sexual drive or instinct. The libido is couched in self-preservation, but also preservation of the species. Again, thinking about the Victorian idea that like sex is for reproduction because we've got to continue the species. So as Funder explains when he discusses this, sex is simply life to Freud. Sex is necessary for procreation, and that enjoyment of sex is actually an important part of being alive for a lot of folks. Now, the one that is not talked about very much is Thanatos. And so Thanatos, Freud argued, is the death drive or death instinct. And he said this is as powerful as the life instinct, and that people have both. This is our primary pervasive drive to destroy, including, at times, to destroy ourselves. This is how Freud explained things like suicide and martyrdom. Again, thinking about the time Freud lived, there was a lot of war at that time, and in particular, as he's writing a lot of his theories, World War I happened, right? And they just called it the Great War. They didn't know there was going to be a World War II, right? They were hoping there wouldn't be. And there was just carnage everywhere, right? And looking around, observing this, Freud was like, people seem to really enjoy aggression. And it made him believe that the tendency to destroy had to be given equal footing and equal consideration with that tendency to live, right, to create. He talked about entropy, and I'll break that up here for y'all. So entropy is the basic force in the universe towards randomness and disorder. And this is like a physics principle that ordered systems tend towards disorder over time. And he thought that this was, again, part of the roots of Thanatos, the death instinct. And yes, Thanatos and Thanos from the Marvel universe come from the same root words, right? Nobody except Freud picked up on this piece of his theory. No one made a big deal about the death instincts. People said, Freud explained it, so we're good. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Also, many later theorists didn't really believe in Thanatos or the step drive. The main idea, though, and why Freud came up with this concept is that, you know, aggression is so common among humans. It has to come from someplace. Freud had difficulty explaining this idea because people have a hard time swallowing the concept of having a drive to destroy others and to destroy yourself. Freud also talked about the fusion of these two instincts. He thought that a lot of behavior, and in fact every behavior, had both life and death instincts in the decision-making process, maybe unconsciously. And this related to his idea of the doctrine of opposites. Everything implies and requires its opposite. Life requires death. Happiness requires sadness. And that extremes on any scale may be more similar to each other than the extreme is to the middle. And I'll give you an example of this more concretely. So I talked before about how profound 9/11 was for me. One of our religious studies professors sat on a panel a couple weeks after 9/11 to help us sort of process things, right? And one of the things he said is that fundamentalists of any religion, be it Islam, Christianity, Judaism, paganism, what have you, are more similar to each other than they are to other members of their own faith, right? And there's an element of that, you can feel that. The other thing that might help you conceptualize this is how we think of the political spectrum as a line. But really, when you get out on the extremes, it kind of wraps back around, right? So, for example, I know people both who refuse to use birth control on one side because they're very conservative Christian and they don't think God wants them to do that. On the other side, because they're very liberal crunchy, right? And they don't want to put extra chemicals in their body. Same, results. The other extreme example when you wrap around is thinking about how like the MAGA folks, and no offense to anyone who's MAGA in the room, because I know that it's the extreme of the MAGA who are horribly callous towards other people, very similar to how the Bernie bros acted, right? And so you could see this wraparound. Alrighty, we will pick up there on Wednesday and talk about Freud's psychosexual stages. Always fun.